Welcome to Schmidt List, where we inspire and educate emerging leaders by bringing you conversations with the best experts and thought contributors in technology and design. Thank you for joining us today. Now let's listen in as your host, President at Foundry Kurt Schmidt, speaks with this episode's inspiring leaders.
Brad, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Kurt. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic, especially now that you are here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. It's great to have a chance to participate in your podcast. And I've been a longtime listener and first-time caller, as they say.
First-time caller. Got it. Love it. Brad, tell me about the work you do. Who do you do it for?
I work with a lot of folks in technology, typically in leadership positions, maybe the owner of a professional services organization in technology, or leaders in large enterprise technology organizations. And a lot of the work that I do is around helping them to become better leaders and to grow better leaders inside their organizations.
Great. That sounds like really fulfilling work.
It is. I deeply enjoy what I do. I spent about 30 years in software engineering and made the switch as more and more of my engineering engagements became more oriented around helping people grow and change, and had to learn a lot about how to do that, because that isn't something they teach you in computer science school. But it's deeply fulfilling work. It's very meaningful to me to help people grow themselves and learn the ways that people grow, and to be a part of that is just a lovely thing.
That's great. I want to jump into our subject today because we're seeing a lot of disruption just happen in the country in general. So we've got tax, or not tax, but interest rates climbing, right? We've got inflation that has been a problem for a while. We've got housing crisis, right? Where there's not enough houses for people. Apparently, people can't afford them. We still got a big disparity in, the debt ceiling is finally sounds like it's going to be covered.
Real close. Real close. I think the Senate voted today.
Okay.
So
we'll see. But again, there's so much happening all the time when it comes to it. And so the idea of being a leader during this time is really challenging. I know I personally, as a leader in my organization, found it challenging, right? Because you're not just worried about you and your business, but your employees as well, and how they are faring throughout this, right? And how can you best support them and challenge them? But I also have to self-care too, right? Because you're no good if you can't, right? It's like they tell you on the plane, put the mask on yourself first, then on your child, right?
Exactly right.
So in your opinion, what have you seen over the last 6 months, and where do you see the next 6 months going? What advice would you give leaders in terms of what's happening in the economy and how to maintain perspective?
Sure. I think just one caveat is I am not an economist. So I am not going to tell you which way it's going to go, or hard landing, soft landing, any of that kind of stuff. And if I did, you should not listen to me, because that would be a total Dunning-Kruger move on me.
Brad
right?
is not a lawyer, and he's not a tax consultant, and he's not
a tax consultant. I'm not an economist.
So from a leadership perspective, though, Brad, I know you're not an accountant or all these things, but from a leadership perspective, how should we be viewing the disruption that's going on, and how do we maintain perspective as a leader throughout this sort of confusion?
I think you touched on some of the highlights. I think the first thing that leaders need to always be doing is to be taking really, really good care of themselves. And a tendency is for the leader to tend to want to sacrifice and suffer. And there's a reason that the saying is that you love your neighbor as you love yourself. And that kind of implies that you have to love yourself first. As a leader, if you're not taking good care of yourself, you're setting an example of how you expect your people to behave. And you can't expect them to be really good to themselves and to be really effective and to be making really good decisions if they're exhausted and working all the time because they see you exhausted and working all the time. Not that there are never times to put in some extra hours, but it's important for the leader to have the presence of mind to know how to care for themselves really well and how to be present and to be effective. And the other part that you touched on is the piece of empathy, of understanding and taking the pulse of where the leaders' people are inside of in their heads, what they're going through, what they're experiencing, and be open to hearing their concerns about what the organization is going through, what's going to happen to us in this crazy time. And are we going to be downsizing? How are we going to be reacting to these big events that are going on? Because that way they can make really good choices for themselves. And as a leader, that's really what you want. Not just stay on the bench until I have to let you go, but like, here is how we're going to be making decisions about, and here is what you can expect to happen. You know, people on the bench are not a sustainable thing in a professional services organization. Right. And here's how we're dealing with that. Here's what we're doing to react to that. And in your situation, you're going to need to evaluate. And as a leader, your ability to calmly convey that to people is going to yield much better outcomes for folks than pretending everything is great because that's in the near-term best interests of the firm.
Yeah, I totally get that. But let's talk about a large company too. We've been seeing massive layoffs since the end of last year, right? These organizations, some are laying people off while they still have almost as many job openings still available. So it kind of skews the narrative a bit for people on what's actually happening in the economy, right?
Yeah, and I think I have personally some moral qualms with the situation that those organizations got themselves into in the first place. And as a leader, I think acting in ways that are moral and ethical are paramount because it helps you avoid these kinds of situations where I think what happened was, with money being cheap, leaders were willing to finance with volatile short-term debt strategic hiring, not because they needed those positions filled, but because they wanted to be able to fill positions as they needed them to basically get ahead of the hiring curve. And that seems to have been a strategy that all four firms adopted, probably somewhat in reaction to one another. And the consequence of that is that you end up with, in this situation, everybody knew that eventually the status quo, the era of cheap money, was going to end. And the people that suffer the consequences of that strategic decision are the individual contributors who got hired and didn't happen to have the right skill set at the moment that hiring spree ended. And it's really unfortunate. And I think it really was, I don't think it was done transparently by some of these firms. And I think it's incumbent upon leaders to be checking themselves and to see, are these choices that we're making to do, for example, strategic hiring, ethical and moral, and what's going to happen when it inevitably ends? I think for a long time, people did kind of move through that chain of getting hired by one of the FANG companies. I guess Apple being a notable exception. They haven't really done as much in terms of layoffs, and they didn't do a lot of extraneous hiring. But what's going to happen downstream when eventually this comes to an end? And it's like, well, the company isn't going to suffer. They're just going to, shut off and then lop off the last N,000 people that they hired. Yeah. And that the consequence of that decision will be borne out by those individuals. And that I think that's okay if you're upfront about the risk that people are taking. I'm not sure that was ever the case.
Yeah. Right. Well, let's talk to specifically leaders in terms of not the C-suite, but maybe your leaders in the organization, right? And how they should be attacking this. Because one of the challenges I had is as a leader in larger organizations where I wasn't in charge of the money, right? I was told when layoffs were happening. I was told how much I could give for raises. I was given a lot of constraints in order to be a leader in the organization. And so there was a lot of challenges through that. Speaking to those people, Brad, if I can't control the situation I'm in, but I do need to be a leader and disseminate information to my team, what's your advice for how I should be approaching my team in these sorts of weird, disruptive times?
Yeah, I think it's always, middle management is always the most difficult job because the problems are coming at you from every direction in the org chart. And some of those problems do come down to you from on high. So imagine you're a senior director or a director at one of these organizations and you've seen something like this happen, and now the decision comes down that you've got to trim N%, where N is somewhere between 50 and 100% of your workforce. Yep. How do you manage that? And I think you need to you're being paid to carry that organization's water and deliver the message that they want you to deliver in terms of, hey, this is really unfortunate, and it really is. And you need to find a balance to be very empathetic to the position that people are finding themselves in. That's when leaders' own ability to manage their own emotions about the situation comes right to the front when that kind of pressure is on. And I've had to do layoffs, and it's not a thing that I would ever want to repeat. And so I've always been pretty conservative in how I hired because I didn't want to make what seems like an employment commitment to someone that I couldn't necessarily keep unless I was pretty certain that this was going to be a long thing. Being put in that position as a middle manager where you're not the one making the hiring and firing decisions, but you're the one who has to deliver that message, requires a lot of being able to manage your own emotions about it to avoid scapegoating senior management and to avoid sort of putting blame onto the employee, and just accepting the fact that this is a very sad and tragic thing that's happened.
Terrible situation, and you're in it.
It's a terrible situation and you're in it. And right now we're both in it, and it's even worse because I'm not going to be in it with you. And they're just painful. And that's one of the big burdens of that role is that you end up carrying that water for the organization sometimes, even though you might not have agreed with it to begin with.
Yeah. Well, even worse, I've seen where it's go fire most of your team and then you're going to get fired after you're done firing everyone. Oh man.
In some ways it's a little easier because you can directly, you don't have to carry water anymore. I'm escorting you to the door and I'm going to be going right there with you.
Right behind you. Yeah.
I'm going to be right behind you. And so I can commiserate a lot more. Whereas if I'm going to be staying and you're going to be going, you're not going to take very seriously my sympathetic response because it's not an equivalent situation. The person being laid off is just in a harder than the person doing the laying off who's still going to have a job. And that's a real challenge for a leader, especially when they could see it coming and tried to head it off and couldn't convince senior leadership to make a change.
Well, and I find that when you're new in an organization, right? So with all the layoffs and things that are happening, lots of people are getting hired too and having to get caught up to speed on what's happening and what's happened in the organization. So let's say you are someone who's in a mid-management position, Brad. What sort of questions should they be asking leadership right now in their organizations? What sorts of questions do they want to be asking if they're getting at the transparency maybe that you're hoping that they would?
I think that they should be looking at what are the commitments that we've heard from leaders in the past. What are the strategic objectives and how are we making progress against those strategic objectives? And what are the actual metrics that we said we were going to hit, and where are those metrics today? that are going to be the sort of key performance indicators or key results if you're a KPI or an OKR shop. How is it that we know how it is that we're doing, and how are we preparing ourselves for what's next? It's a very tricky balancing act because it is deeply personal, obviously, to all of us that we continue to be employed and we continue to get paid, and I'm going to disrupt that unnecessarily. And on the other hand, we do want to be good stewards of our teams and be able to help people understand, here is how we'll know what's coming. Here is how we'll have a good idea of what's next, so that you can make an informed choice about, your employment, your continued spot in the organization.
Yeah, because I've been in that, like I mentioned, I've been in that position, and there's times where you're not getting what you need from executive leadership, and you sort of got to, as a strong leader, you sort of got to put a stake in the ground somewhere for your team. And so, I remember getting vision statements that made no sense at all. And then going back to the team, and the team's like, well, how do we impact that vision? And nobody had given me permission, but I just made up sort of, all right, our team is going to focus on this, which would then, achieve that vision or contribute to that vision, right?
Yeah, exactly. Leaders should in those positions lead the best that they can, and trying to get that information and that additional knowledge ahead of time is great. And sometimes you're not going to get it. And so you get the crazy vision statement, or you get nothing from from senior leadership about the things that are going to drive people's decision making, and you take it upon yourself to lead as best you can.
Yeah,
in that void.
It's something that I've seen really, not necessarily bad, but inexperienced leaders run into, where they are in that mid-management position. What they end up doing is, instead of looking at this as a call to action, they look at it as a way to badmouth the company or executives, right? To say like, well, they don't know what the hell they're doing, so we're just going to keep doing whatever we're doing. We're going to show up on time. We're going to leave on time. We're not going to take too much vacation. And, whatever, but they use it as a way to sort of demonize the organ. And they think that, again, like maybe that's bringing them closer to their team, because they're like, yeah, see, I'm like you.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that, as well as the organization is not being great now, so I'm going to complain about it to you. But they don't understand that they're not part of the team. I mean, they're on the team, right? They're part of the team, but they're not the team. They're the leader of the team, and that's a different role, right?
It is, and you have to be willing to accept the consequences of that distinction, that the leader isn't the team, and the emotional push to say something that will make the team feel good, like bad-mouthing executive leadership. You're borrowing from everybody's future, right? You're taking that away from where are we going to be when one of the people on my team works for one of those senior leaders and gets promoted? Or how is that going to be perceived when inevitably some of the bad mouthing that I do gets around the organization? Your ability as a leader to handle your own emotional, I'm just going to call it neediness, to feel appreciated and you have your ego needs met, differentiates leaders a lot. It's not that really experienced leaders don't sometimes feel like throwing executive management under the bus. Not that executive sometimes doesn't deserve to be thrown under the bus.
Right. And it's not that they're not doing it to you on occasion as well.
It's not, but that's the thing. When you work with people, you make decisions, and some of those decisions are great and some of them are not. And we bump and bruise one another. And the leader's ability to handle that with grace is really one of the things that differentiates the ability to say, you know what, that person was just having a really bad day, or, yep, that was a boneheaded decision and I think they're going to regret it later on. And I'm going to And I'm just accept that that's the fact that we're all humans and that I have made boneheaded decisions myself.
Yes, you and I have both made those decisions. Well, to that point, Brad, there's always an opportunity to improve. So, obviously, a person like yourself comes in and coaches these folks. But what are some resources that you've suggested to people that can help them become better leaders, or things that my dad always said? There's two kinds of people in the world. There's people who have a coach and people that don't know they need a coach. And I've always taken that to heart. But there's other resources out there that can help people. So, are you a book guy? Are you a conference guy? Like, what do you like to suggest to people to grow their leadership skills?
Yeah, I think, and thanks for the coaching plug. I think human to human interaction is one of the most powerful levers that we have. What we're talking about developing is the leader's EQ. And I speak a lot at conferences, and I work with tech people and technology folks. And remember, I am a 30-year software engineer. We are not positively selected for EQ at the beginning of our careers.
For sure.
In a lot of cases, we're negatively selected for EQ at the beginnings of our careers. Mm-hmm. And as we get promoted into leadership positions, that really can cause some challenges for a lot of folks. And I help, in my profession, I help people to unwind those challenges. When I'm speaking at a conference, I ask people about what are the skills that differentiate. And I won't go through the whole thing on the podcast, but what comes back from the group is that the differentiating skill set isn't how smart the leader is, which is unfortunate because tech people tend to skew pretty far over to the right side of the bell curve. And it's not their technical qualifications, which is usually what gets you promoted as a leader into a leadership position in tech. It's you are a really good engineer in some way. You're really good at what your job was, the technical aspects of your job. And so we're going to make you a leader. And you think falsely that, it's because I know my job really well and I'm smart that makes the difference.
And I can tell other people how to do their job now.
And now I can tell other people, and that's how the organization will grow. And that's not a silly thing. It's just not correct. And so developing your own EQ skills is the single most effective thing that you can do. And that's obviously not true for everybody. You could be a very high EQ leader of people in an engineering organization and in charge of a surgical ward, and there it's going to be your TQ. Your technical skills are going to be the big gap that you have to overcome. Yeah. But for most people, most of the time, developing their EQ skills is what matters. And that's why coaching is the predominant mechanism in the field, because human beings are just better at helping other human beings develop those skills. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of great books to give you a primer on it, and experiences also can give you a great primer on it. I learned a lot of EQ skills by becoming a parent and learning that if I could manage my reaction to things when my kids did crazy stuff, it had a dramatic impact on the overall family dynamic. And I'm like, okay, I'm kind of a leader in my family, and my ability to, lose it when I get backtalk or when I get, misbehavior or other things that happen really makes me a much more effective parent, and it makes for a much more effective family organization. Yeah. And the same thing holds true once you become a manager of people. Now, the people that work for you are not children. This analogy, it's just an analogy. It falls apart. Don't treat your people like kids.
Sure.
But your ability to manage you is paramount. So understanding how emotions work is a great start. And it's not a topic that we speak a lot about in school. Susan David is an author she's a researcher out of Harvard, and she wrote a great book kind of condensing a lot of her research material called Emotional Agility. And it's really centered around how do I take in information from my emotions. And she frames it as, look, emotions are just data. They're just another form of data. And the better you get at understanding that I am not angry the statement I am angry is very different from the statement I notice I'm feeling angry. And it's a good step from distancing your emotions from you.
Right.
And she has a lot of those kind of introductory skill developments around helping people learn how emotions are perceived in themselves and some skills that you can build, which in turn helps you to build those skills. So that was a really long answer.
No, it's great. I love it. No, I love it. The last question I want to ask you is that because I do think the coaching is important, and here's why. The coaching has always been, and mentorship has been important to me because, and you kind of called it out, there's a context to all of these things, right? There's a contextual side that we as humans, in order to truly understand, I feel, we need to understand the context within these situations that are being framed for us, right? So the company's acting flaky. Are they going to do layoffs? My team is acting weird. My boss is acting weird, whatever the case may be. And so no amount of books can necessarily help you with that. And that's why I always strongly encourage people to find a mentor, and again, it doesn't have to be like official stamped mentor thing. It can be someone that you trust that has maybe more experience than you that can give you a new perspective to look at things, right? How do you find the coaching? How have you seen coaching change people in that respect, Brad? How important is that context?
I think it's really important. And I think to continue the point from earlier, your emotional situation is part of that context. And a book is never going to ask you, how are you feeling right now? And that's such an important tool such an important piece of data to help understand your situation and what you need to do and focus on. And your next steps is your own emotional context. I think going along with that, because a human-to-human interaction, a mentoring or a coaching interaction is going to give the opportunity to really build empathy and to give an empathetic response to what you're going through. So when I work with people and I ask them that question all the time, how are you feeling right now about that situation that you've just described? Oftentimes it's the first time they've thought about it to really take a look at, oh yeah, you know what? I'm really feeling frustrated or I'm really feeling angry. And I'm like, well, tell me about that. Like, why are you feeling that way? Is the kind of thing that a coach can do. The other big part, when I'm working with trying to change a behavior, I want to, not work at night so that I can see my kids grow up, those kinds of things. A coach is not unlike what a fitness coach does, right? Sure. You don't hire a fitness coach to lift your weights for you. You hire them to make sure that you lift your weights, that you do your exercises. And that accountability that's outside of the organization, a disinterested third party that can hold you to account, especially if you're the owner of the company or the founder, someone who isn't accountable to many people other than yourself, having that is a really powerful tool for driving behavioral change.
I love it. I think, again, it's so important that people understand that even if it's somebody, who's a professional like yourself, or it's someone in your life that's a mentor, when the times are tough and the disruption is happening that we're seeing right now, I think the biggest takeaway here is don't try to solve it by yourself because...
I think that's a great point, Kurt. You're not alone. And one of the things that I consistently come across, and this might be my sample size because I work primarily with tech folks, I ask them, who do you network with? Who do you talk to? And almost always the answer is, I don't really do any of that.
Really, yep.
And that contributes to your emotional health when you can go and talk to people and find out that everybody's in pretty much the same boat as you are. You're like, oh, okay. And you can ask silly questions like, well, what are you doing about it? And find out what's worked. And what did you do the last time that we had an economic downturn? And, getting that from another person is just experientially different. It just creates a different emotional dynamic for someone. You can read about it all day, and I do a ton of reading, but sharing with somebody else just produces different outcomes for folks.
Yep.
I will say, your sort of informal mentoring relationship, they won't have the kind of professional training in helping people grow and change. And so, you do kind of get what you pay for. And in addition to that, you kind of pay for what you get. I've, as a coach, found that I don't do a ton of free coaching engagements. I'll do some mentoring and I'll happily dispense advice, but I don't do a ton of free coaching engagements because people tend not to change.
Very common. All right. So, Brad, the idea of having that personal coach is something that we both find very important. If I want to talk to you about the work you do and where you do it, where do I find out more info, Brad?
The easiest way would be to point your browser at leadership-engineering.com, and that will get you to a spot where you can talk to me. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect with folks. My name is Brad Koehn, Koehn, spelled just like it sounds. That is somewhat tongue-in-cheek. And I'm happy to talk with you. And I'm happy to talk with your organization as well. Like I said, I do talks on leadership, and I am very passionate about the subject. And I spend a lot of time in and around leaders in technology organizations, and spend a bunch of time in my career technology leader. And I feel like I've got some valuable things to share with people. And I'm really just looking for more opportunities to do that.
Great. Well, and thank you for bringing that knowledge to the show here today, Brad. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. It's always great talking with you, Kurt, and you're so much fun and
appreciate that.
Insightful. I really enjoy just being able to talk as two folks that have been in this biz for a while and have a few things to share with the world.
Yeah, we do. We certainly do. Well, Brad, we'll have to do a part 2 in the future, okay?
I would love to do that.
We hope you join us for more conversations in the future with leading experts in technology and design. Please contact us at schmidt-list.com and foundrymakes.com for more information.